degrees. Stratos?
Yes, we have a case here where the IOL placed in the arterial chamber and the capsular ring were dropped into the vitreous cavity. So I have to remove the vitreous ring, the capsular ring, and then having the plate of the IOL in the anterior chamber, I use insulin needle as a guide to externalize the haptic at 12 o'clock, and the same way I use the insulin needle at 6 o'clock to externalize the other haptic. And I create pockets, scleral pockets with the MVR blade, and I embedded the haptic there, avoiding to suturing. I just suture the scleral flap and then the conjunctiva. And the IOL, as you can see, is well centered.
Any comments from the panel? Stratos, does this technique can be used for any type of lens?
Mainly for 3 pieces IOL.
And do any of the faculty have experience with using the, making a scleral tunnel, for example, with a 25 gauge trocars and putting the haptics of these lenses in those tunnels without making a flap and without suturing? Anybody in the panel?
I had an experience using the Dork's special made forceps for taking the haptics out, but it broke me the haptics, so I decided to use the 25G Alcon's forceps, which are more flexible and don't break the haptics.
As you mentioned, one of the problems with these techniques are the breakage of the haptic. Any pros or tricks what one can do to prevent that from happening?
I think the key is to grab the haptic at the end of the haptic. If you grab it, say 2 millimeters from the end of the haptic, as you pull it through the sclerotomy, there is a tendency for that to twist, flex the haptic and cause breakage. As long as you're on the end of the haptic, as you pull your forceps out, there's really no exposure of the edge of the end of the haptic to the sclerotomy, so you don't tend to break the haptics.
And I do have a question for the panel. In the past, we used to do a lot of this manipulation of the IOL inside the vitreous cavity, and we end up having a lot of new breaks and stuff. These days, the IOLs are much softer. Do you worry, John, about touching the vitreous base or creating new breaks without externalizing the IOL to do the suturing?
It's actually fairly rare for me to have to treat a retinal break, and I'm talking maybe 1 in 20 cases. I do a pretty thorough vitrectomy, and I don't shave the vitreous base, but I remove the vitreous base aggressively. I think if the eye has not had a very complete vitrectomy, that certainly is a concern.
I think that's a very good point, to do a vitrectomy before manipulating the lens. And as Stratos showed you, it's very important also to examine the eye looking for those mortar rings. Because sometimes you do you have the dislocated IOL, you remove the dislocated IOL, and if you do a peripheral scar depressed exam at the end to look for tears, as Andre mentioned, sometimes you may see one of these mortar rings hiding back there because they're elastic and they can just stay there, and the last thing you want is that later on they may dislodge into the vitreous cavity.